Now, as insecurity continues to deepen across Nigeria amid continuing clashes between herders and farmers and growing concern over so-called gun-wielding killer herdsmen, President Buhari has approved ranching and the revival of forest reserves across Nigeria. The plan includes rehabilitating grazing reserves in the states, but the president has caused controversy by laying into governors from the south, describing their recent decision to ban open grazing as illegal and insisting that it infringes on the constitutional right of Nigerians to move freely in any part of the country. As you may know, southern governors recently met and banned open grazing in the region in an attempt to end the frequent clashes between farmers and herders. They also called for restructuring of Nigeria as a way of finding more permanent solutions to the country's numerous problems. So lots of constitutional questions of policing, reform and restructuring swirling around the problem of insecurity in Nigeria. Well, let's find out what my first guest makes of all that. Professor Fidelis Oditah is properly eminent, one of the most accomplished legal minds in Britain, Nigeria and Africa today. He's Queen's Counsel in the UK and Senior Advocate of Nigeria and holds 3 postgraduate degrees from Oxford. He's also President of the Nigerian branch of the International Law Association and runs a successful legal practice in both Nigeria and the UK. And Professor Oditah joins me now from our Lagos studios. Thank you very much indeed, Professor, for joining us. Very honored and delighted to have you here. And as you know, President Buhari has queried the legality of the ban on open grazing by Nigeria's southern governors. He suggests it is its legality is questionable. Is it?
Thank you, Charles. I think the view of President Buhari is entirely mistaken, which is perhaps surprising. But beyond mistaken, President Buhari, as patron of Miyetti Allah, which is the Association of Cattle Breeders in Nigeria, also has a conflict of interest. There is plainly, as an owner of cows which have been grazing on people's farmlands, and as patron of the umbrella association, Miyetti Allah, President Buhari has huge and irrevocable conflicts of interest. I would have thought that someone in his position won't speak at all. But to come to the substance of the question, which is whether he knows whether he's right, I think he's plainly wrong. The freedom of movement, which is guaranteed by the Constitution, is fundamental human right to move. Cattle are not humans any more than pigeons or rats are. Yes, the herders have a right to move, but they've got no right to move with any animals, and they've got no right to wield any arms. Of course, I'm sure if they were perambulating all over Nigeria, or trekking from Kano to Asaba or anywhere in the south, unarmed and without cars, no one would molest them because they will be exercising their right to freedom of movement. Of course, one might query whether really that is an ideal way to cover a distance of over 1,000 kilometers. Perhaps they will be exercising, but there is absolutely no doubt that the herders have no right to move with their cows anywhere, whether in the north or in the south. But I'm not sure why President Buhari has chosen to respond to the resolution of Southern governors, because as I recall, 2 or 3 months ago, the Northern governors came to the same conclusion. And it is obvious to everyone that it is simply untenable to allow marauding herders who engage in banditry, kidnapping, and other forms of criminal activity at the same time that the cows under their control destroy farmlands which have cost millions of naira to build.
Well, and of course that point you make about the northern governors agreeing some sort of transformation plan with regard to open grazing. That the ban itself is not new either. I mean, it was banned by the Nigerian Economic Council previously. But I mean, given your legal background, your knowledge of the law and so on, and I mean, at one point in the UK, you were spoken of as possibly the first black Attorney General in Britain, that there was serious consideration given to that. What's your assessment of the quality of legal advice that the President is getting from his Attorney General?
I don't know. I have not seen the advice which the Attorney General has provided, but to the extent that I have listened to the utterances of the Attorney General, and insofar as those utterances represent the advice he's been giving to the President, the advice is plainly erroneous. I watched Channels Television a few days ago when the Attorney General very embarrassingly and most ignorantly said that the ban on open grazing was similar to banning Igbo traders in the north, especially Kano, from selling spare parts. I mean, you can't be more ignorant than that, because there is simply no analogy, let alone one that one can say is inapposite. In the case of the spare parts dealers, they rent shops or build shops and operate from their shops. In the case of herders, they refuse to stay in ranches. They wander from one city to another, committing crimes, destroying farmlands, and kidnapping people in the process. So there is plainly no basis to compare the two. And insofar as that's the type of advice that the Attorney General has been giving to the President, the advice is plainly erroneous. And I think he has misled the President. I've also heard him in the past give advice on why the executive arm will not obey court orders. He took refuge in national security. But of course, it's for the courts also to consider issues of national security. So you have to say there must be a question mark as to the quality of the advice, which Mr. Malami has been preferring to the President.
And we've got about a minute before we have to take a break, but we will come back and keep talking with you. But just briefly, what do you think of the President's plan to revive forest reserves across Nigeria, and his ostensible plan to approve ranching?
Well, I mean, he can approve ranching, but the question whether the President can impose forest reserves by fiat is plainly one that is controversial, because that is an aspect which one finds on the residual list, and therefore the governors are able to make some laws in relation to that. But I think the President is also quite mistaken in thinking that that there's anything like national forests, and that the national forest belongs to the nation or the federal government, which he could then, by some fiat from Abuja, direct. My understanding is that under the Land Use Act, all land in a state is vested in the governor.
Right.
It's not vested in the federal government. There are areas where the federal government might have some interest in relation to Abuja and some pockets of land called federal land, but there is no such thing in relation to forestry.
Okay, we'll come back and talk about this some more, but I've got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Professor Fidelis Oditah, Queen's Counsel and Senior Advocate of Nigeria, about the problems of insecurity in Nigeria. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyekolu. Now, if Nigeria had a mind of its own, it would be positively humming with difficult questions about insurgencies, armed conflicts, and violent expressions of identity politics, and about horrific abductions, human rights violations, corruption, unemployment, arrested development, ethnic conflict, and the list goes on. It's all rather beginning to look like institutionalized insecurity, and it's leaving an indelible mark on the psyche of the Nigerian people. In fact, there is an argument in legal circles which suggests that the violence of the Fourth Republic has its roots in Nigeria's constitution, and they cite several problematic aspects of the 1999 Nigerian constitution to buttress that point, including the centralization of the police at the federal level with limited subnational oversight, and the ambiguous concept of indigeneity, or coming from one part of the country and having rights there and nowhere else. So some have argued that these constitutional tenets, among others, help to facilitate instability. And Professor Fidelis Oditah, Queen's Counsel in the UK and Senior Advocate of Nigeria, who's President of the Nigerian branch of the International Law Association, is still with me from our Lagos studios. Thank you for staying with us. I want to tap into your considerable legal brain. Do you agree with that analysis that there are constitutional roots that make conflict more likely in Nigeria, such as designing a constitution to prevent violent separatist movements in the regions, and that although these constitutional reforms were a response to Nigeria's history, the civil war, etc., it is evident that they've given rise to a new sort of insecurity in the country?
Yes, I agree. First, the police. Of course, every aspect of our armed forces is centralized. The police is no exception. But there is the incongruity in making the governor of a state the chief security officer and then having the commissioner of police appointed federally, such that he reports to the Inspector General of Police and not to the governor. And often we've seen many governors throwing their arms up in the air, saying they've got no control. So you give a man a constitutional responsibility, but then on the other hand, you take away the means and the capacity to make that responsibility, to discharge that responsibility. That's a huge flaw. And the calls for the decentralization of police and the devolution of powers in other respects must continue, and they seem to me to be inevitable. I mean, sometimes people talk about restructuring, but that means different things to different people. But what is clear to everyone is that the present arrangement is simply untenable. Now, you also mentioned the concept of indigeneity. Of course, the Constitution provides that you are an indigene of where your father is born. That itself is a cynical ploy by politicians to divide and rule us. In every other respect, if you're going to school, if you're going to pay your tax, if you're going to carry on business, no one asks you, where are you from in terms of your indigeneship. But in relation to politics, you are required to go back to your village. And that, I think, is most unfair and untenable. You may be born in Lagos, and for all you know, you've never been to any village, but that's where historically your father comes from. If you aspire to political office, you are required to go back there where you are not known. You have no real connection. You are required to contest from there. I think that type of structure, if anything, if it was intended to unify the country, has done more harm to and has caused more disunity than perhaps any other constitutional provision. But there are other things, like you see, federal character. You should reflect federal character in the appointments you make. And we've seen how President Buhari has completely subverted that, turned it on his head, and decided to make virtually a substantial majority of his appointments from the north. And before him, we would have thought that that was impossible. So there are many aspects of the Constitution which are really worried, which we must reform. But I find it sad because it's partly how we, as the operators of the Constitution, have seen it. I've given the example of Buhari. He could have done things differently. So also the courts could have interpreted the Constitution differently and achieved better results. But in the absence of that type of constructive engagement, the solution is to have to continue to amend the Constitution. It's not simply because the Constitution was given to us by the military junta. It's also because people have had very limited contribution to it, and the way that lawmaking is done in Nigeria often involving very limited consultation. So it's perhaps inevitable that we'll find significant lacuna in the Constitution. Those things need to change. We have enacted a Constitution which is designed to cause disunity and which is designed to imperil our Fourth Republic.
Well, that's a very, very enlightening analysis. The problem, of course, is that contemporary conflicts in Nigeria, not all, but many of them, are less about gaining autonomy from the federal government and more about gaining access within the quota system established by the so-called federal character principle that you were talking about, and a frustration over the failure of democracy to deliver.
Yeah, so I think I was watching the early morning program today, and someone was pointing out correctly that in Nigeria we have completely subverted merit. I don't think that one can blame the federal character for that. You cannot get employment in the public sector without paying bribe. You cannot get promotion without paying bribe. And in many cases, the least qualified person is promoted. So I don't understand how we think we can really move forward with a situation where we promote mediocrity and we disdain knowledge and intellect. Every society puts its best foot forward. When we play football, when we play other sports, we try to select our best. And as we're going to Olympics in Tokyo this year, we're seeking to identify our best. But in every other area of our national life, somehow we believe that mediocres can deliver us. I don't see how that is possible. Yes, of course, the federal character was a response to the dominance largely of public service by the Southerners. But no one has told anyone else, whether the Northerners or the Middle Belters or the Southerners, not to aspire. And I do not believe that federal character really can be seen as a refuge for the mediocrity we have seen in the appointments, in the recruitment, promotion of public officers, and in the political appointments. Yes, you can blame federal character, which was introduced to avoid dominance, but it has now been subverted. Like most things in Nigeria, I always say the problem is not legislation, it's the failure or the subversion of the legislation, failure of the operators to operate according to the spirit and letters of the law. If, for example, you're required to reflect the federal character, you can take someone who is very qualified from the north or very qualified from the south, very qualified from the south-south, or very qualified from the southeast. Nothing prevents you from doing that. What we find is that they take any person, however mediocre that person is, and simply say, oh, well, put the person's name forward. And you see that as a result of that, when you go to the public service, especially Abuja, you really weep for the country, because you see that that public service has no capacity to perform the true functions of a public service, and that we're just deceiving ourselves. There is no way we can make progress with the way things are arranged. Of course, those at the top are very old, and they would say, well, they will soon die, and it will cease to be their problem. But I really feel very sorry for the younger ones who are being left with a very broken country, completely impoverished, no values, and really nothing works.
Well, on that rather depressing note, but very enlightening conversation, I want to say thank you very much indeed, Professor Fidelis Oditah, Queen's Counsel in the UK, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, and President of the Nigerian branch of the International Law Association. And he was talking to me from our Lagos studio.